You see the numbers and they don't make sense. 3,000 men against 25,000, a tiny blocking force against an entire army in full retreat. It sounds like a legend, something out of an old saga. But this isn't a myth. This is Libya. The year is 1941. A British general makes a wild gamble, a 1 in 100 shot, sending a handful of men and guns on a desperate race across a barren desert to cut off a force 8 times its size. What happens when they get there? What happens when 25,000 desperate men try to break through a line held by just 3,000? This is the story of Beda Fomm, the most complete, lopsided victory of the Second World War. In the winter of 1940, the war in North Africa was a joke. Mussolini's massive 10th Army had invaded Egypt, then stopped, building fortified camps in the sand. On December 9th, 1940, thus, a much smaller British and Commonwealth force under General Richard O'Connor punched back. Operation Compass wasn't supposed to be a conquest. It was a 5-day raid, but the Italians collapsed. Sidi Barrani fell, Bardia, Tobruk. The British didn't stop. For 2 months, they chased the broken 10th Army west, across 300 miles of Libya. By early February 1941, the Italians were in a full-blown panic. Their only hope was to escape south, down the coastal road, the Via Balbia, to safety, and O'Connor was determined to stop them. The stage is set. You have an entire Italian army, broken but still massive, fleeing for its life down a single road. And you have a small disorganization, professional British force, exhausted but victorious, snapping at their heels. The trap is about to be set. If you value documented military history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This account is built on hard facts, drawn directly from the British official history, specifically Volume 1 of the Mediterranean and Middle East by Major General Arbont S.O. Playfair, which used the original battlefield reports, and cross-referenced with modern analysis found in works like James Holland's The War in the Desert, which digs into the unit war diaries and personal accounts from the men who were actually there. Now, back to the information. The map told Richard O'Connor 2 stories. The first was obvious. It was the remnant of the Italian 10th Army, commanded by Generale di Corpo d'Armata Giuseppe Tellera, was retreating along the coast of Cyrenaica. They were following the great sweeping curve of the Jebel Akhdar, the Green Mountain. The main body of O'Connor's force, the 6th Australian Division, was pushing them hard, right on their tail. But tanks and trucks on a paved road are always faster than infantry. The Italians, even in their chaos, would likely outrun them and escape. But there was a second story on that map. A shortcut, a faint line, barely a track, that cut straight across the chord of the Jebel Akhdar. It was a brutal, almost featureless expanse of desert gravel and rock. 150 miles of absolutely nothing. To send an armored force across it was a monumental risk. Navigation would be by compass alone. Breakdowns would be fatal. Any vehicle left behind would be lost forever. If they got lost, if they ran out of fuel or water, they would simply vanish into the sand. But if it worked, if a fast-moving column could survive that crossing, it could emerge back on the Via Balbia south of the Italians. It could slam the door shut. O'Connor looked at his own commander, General Archibald Wavell. He asked for permission to try. Wavell knew the risks, but he trusted O'Connor. The order was given. The gamble was on. The job fell to the 7th Armored Division, the legendary Desert Rats. Their commander, Major General Michael O'Moore Crea, was ordered to detach a flying column for the mission. It would be a small, self-contained battle group, built for speed. It needed to be light enough to move fast, but strong enough to hold off an army. The unit was given a simple, functional name, Combe Force, after its commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Combe. Combe was a cavalryman from the 11th Hussars. His force was a collection of parts. He had his own 11th Hussars and their Rolls-Royce and Morris armored cars for reconnaissance. For hitting power, he had the 2nd Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, a crack motor infantry unit. For artillery, he had C Battery of the 4th Royal Horse Artillery, with its 8 25-pounder field guns. And for killing tanks, he had 9 Bofors 37mm anti-tank guns on portees, trucks with the guns mounted on the back, total strength, around 2,000 men. Their orders were chillingly simple. Cross 150 miles of desert in 33 hours, seize the coastal road near the hamlet of Sidi Saleh, and block the Italian 10th Army. All of it, at dawn on February 4th, 1941. Combe Force moved out from its assembly point at Msus. The rest of the 7th Armored Division, specifically the 4th Armored Brigade with its faster cruiser tanks, was supposed to follow, but first, Combe Force was on its own. The fate of the entire campaign now rested on 2,000 men and a handful of trucks and armored cars, driving into the unknown. The crossing was a nightmare. A freezing wind whipped up a sandstorm that cut visibility to near zero. The desert floor was not flat sand, it was a hard, rocky surface, strewn with boulders that shattered suspensions and axles. Vehicles broke down constantly. Mechanics worked in the biting wind, their hands raw, to get them moving again. They navigated by the sun when they could see it, and by compass when they couldn't. The armored cars of the 11th Hussars fanned out ahead, scouting the way, trying to find a path through the treacherous ground. For a day and a night, they pushed south, a tiny column of steel lost in a vast, hostile wilderness. They were completely out of contact. No one knew if they were alive or dead, on course or hopelessly lost. They were racing against time and against an entire army they couldn't see. At 2:30 in the afternoon on February 5th, a scout from the 11th Hussars crested a low ridge. Below him, shimmering in the heat haze, was a thin black line. The Via Balbia, the coastal road. They had made it. They had beaten the Italians. Combe moved his force forward cautiously. They established a roadblock near a small white mosque in a slight rise in the ground they nicknamed the Pimple. The riflemen of the 2nd Rifle Brigade dug in, sighting their Bren guns and Boy's anti-tank rifles. The gunners of C Battery, 4th RHA, unlimbered their 25-pounders and calculated their firing lines. The anti-tank guns were positioned to cover the road from both directions. Then they waited. The desert was silent. The silence didn't last. Just before 3 o'clock, the lookouts spotted dust to the north. A column of Italian vehicles was approaching. It wasn't the main army, just the leading edge of the retreat. A collection of staff cars, supply trucks, and civilian vehicles commandeered by fleeing officers. The British held their fire. They let the front of the column drive right into the kill zone. Then Combe gave the order. The first shells from the 25-pounders screamed in, landing with perfect accuracy among the trucks. The Beaufort's anti-tank guns opened up, their solid shot punching through engine blocks. The heavy machine guns of the Rifle Brigade swept the road. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Vehicles swerved and crashed. Men bailed out, running for cover in the shallow ditches. The front of the Italian column dissolved into a junkyard of burning wreckage and chaos. The trap was sprung, but this was just the beginning. This was just the bait. The real Italian army was still coming. The first few hours were a chaotic series of small, sharp engagements. Italian reconnaissance units would probe the roadblock, be shot to pieces by the concealed British guns, and retreat. But as the afternoon wore on, the pressure mounted. The trickle of vehicles from the north became a steady stream, then a flood. Combe could now see the sheer scale of what was bearing down on him. It was the entire Italian 10th Army. Thousands of trucks, hundreds of guns, dozens of tanks, and 25,000 desperate men, all funneling down this one narrow road. And all he had to stop them were 2,000 riflemen and a handful of guns. The British artillery was magnificent. The 8 guns of C Battery, 4th RHA, fired relentlessly, their crews working like demons. They broke up Italian formations before they could even deploy to attack. They targeted vehicles, guns, concentrations of infantry. Every shell that landed on the packed road caused more chaos, creating more blockages, piling wreckage upon wreckage. But artillery alone couldn't hold the line. The Italians began to organize. They brought their own artillery into action. And shells started to fall around the British positions on the Pimple. Their infantry, disorganized but numerous, began to press forward on foot, trying to flank the small British perimeter. The men of the 2nd Rifle Brigade met them with disciplined, accurate fire from their rifles and Bren guns. It was a close-run thing. At times, the Italian infantry got within a few hundred yards of the British positions before being driven back. The fate of North Africa was being decided by a few hundred riflemen dug into shallow scrapes in the sand. As darkness fell on February 5th, the situation was critical. Combe force was hanging on, but just barely. They were surrounded, massively outnumbered, and running low on ammunition. The rest of the 7th Armored Division was supposed to be right behind them, but the desert crossing had delayed them. For a few terrifying hours, Combe and his men were utterly alone. They knew that when the sun came up, the full weight of the Italian army would come crashing down on them. If you believe in telling history from the ground level, with the names and numbers that matter, hit that subscribe button. It helps us continue to dig up these incredible stories. We are constantly researching, looking for the details that bring these moments to life. Back to the desperate defense at Beda Fomm. The night of February 5th to 6th was a surreal landscape of fire and shadow. The road was a burning snake of wrecked vehicles, stretching for miles to the north. The British gunners continued to fire at targets illuminated by the flames. Small groups of Italian soldiers tried to infiltrate the British lines under the cover of darkness, leading to frantic, close-quarter fights lit by muzzle flashes. The men of Combe Force were exhausted. They had been driving and fighting for 2 days straight, but they held on. Just as the situation seemed most desperate, they heard it. The sound of engines from the east, from the desert. At first, they feared it was another Italian column that had somehow circled around them. But then the shapes emerged from the gloom. They were British tanks. A squadron of the 3rd, the King's Own Hussars, the leading element of the 4th Armored Brigade, had finally arrived. Soon after, more tanks and the guns of the 1st Royal Horse Artillery rumbled into position. The balance had shifted. Combe Force was no longer alone. When dawn broke on February 6th, General Tellerus saw that his situation had gone from bad to catastrophic. The roadblock was no longer just a thin screen of infantry and guns. It was now backed by cruiser tanks. But he had no choice. His army was trapped between the advancing Australians to his north and this British blocking force to his south. Surrender was unthinkable. He had to break through. Tellera gathered his remaining armor. The core of his force was the Gruppo Babini, a special armored group with about 60 new Fiat M1340 medium tanks. He also had a collection of older tanks and a swarm of L3 tankettes. He ordered them to attack. The main assault came in the afternoon of February 6th. A wave of about 30 M1340s rumbled forward, straight towards the British positions on the Pimple. This was the moment of crisis. The British cruiser tanks, A9s, A10s, and the faster A13s raced out to meet them. The 2-pounder guns on the British tanks were excellent, but they had a critical weakness. They only fired solid armor-piercing shot. They had no high explosive rounds. This meant they could kill Italian tanks, but they were almost useless against Italian anti-tank guns, which were now deploying in support of their armor. A brutal, swirling tank battle erupted in the open ground west of the road. It was a chaotic melee. British tankers had better training and faster-firing guns. They worked in concert with their artillery, which laid down a curtain of fire that separated the Italian tanks from their supporting infantry. The Italian tankers, for their part, fought with courage. They pressed their attacks despite heavy losses. One M1340 tank was found later with the corpse of its commander, General Tellera himself, inside. He had been mortally wounded while leading the charge from the front. But bravery was not enough. The British 2-pounder guns, both on the tanks and the towed anti-tank guns of the Rifle Brigade, were deadly. They smashed through the thin armor of the Italian M13s. One by one, the Italian tanks were knocked out, brewing up into pillars of black smoke. By the end of the day, the Babini group was shattered. The main Italian armored force had ceased to exist. Yet, they still wouldn't quit. Throughout the day and into the next night, the Italians launched a series of desperate piecemeal attacks. Infantry would try to rush the British lines, only to be cut down by machine gun and artillery fire. Engineers tried to clear paths through the wreckage on the road under fire. Small groups of tanks would make probing attacks, lose a few vehicles, and then pull back. The pressure on the British was immense. Ammunition for the 25-pounders was critically low. Some gun crews were down to their last few rounds. The tank crews were exhausted, having fought continuously for hours. The men of the Rifle Brigade had been in their foxholes for over 36 hours, under constant fire and attack. It was a battle of pure attrition, of sheer will. The British line bent, but it did not break. The morning of February 7th dawned cold and clear. The Italians prepared for one final, desperate throw of the dice. They gathered their last 30 operational M1340 tanks, along with a Bersaglieri motorcycle battalion, for a final charge. This time, they would not be stopped. They planned to charge straight down the road, right through the center of the British position, ignoring losses, to blast a path for the rest of the army to follow. Just after 10 o'clock in the morning, the attack began. The column of 30 Italian tanks rolled forward, picking up speed, with the motorcycle troops clinging to their sides. It was a sight of incredible, suicidal bravery. The British were waiting for them. Every gun that could bear was trained on that narrow stretch of road. The artillery of both the 4th and 1st Royal Horse Artillery, firing over open sights. The anti-tank guns, the 2-pounders of the cruiser tanks. They let them get close, point-blank range, then they opened fire. All of them. At once, the effect was apocalyptic. The lead Italian tank exploded. The one behind it was hit and slewed sideways, blocking the road. The column compressed. The British guns poured fire into the bottleneck. It was a slaughter. Tanks were hit multiple times. Their armor ripped apart. Their crews killed instantly. Within minutes, the entire spearhead of the Italian attack was a smoking, burning scrap heap. The Bersaglieri who survived scattered into the desert. It was over. From the British lines, They saw a single white flag go up, then another, and another. All across the battlefield, the firing died down. A strange silence fell, broken only by the crackle of burning vehicles. It was the silence of total surrender. The Battle of Beda Fomm was finished. The aftermath was one of the most surreal scenes of the war. General O'Connor drove up to the front line to see it for himself. For 20 miles, the Via Balbia was a solid, unbroken river of abandoned and destroyed Italian equipment. Over 100 tanks, 216 guns, 1,500 trucks and cars, and the prisoners. The British had expected to capture a few thousand. They stopped counting at 25,000. The entire remnant of the Italian 10th Army had been scooped into the bag. The British losses were almost unbelievably light in the entire action at Beda Fomm, from the start of the ambush to the final surrender. The British lost just 9 men killed and 17 wounded. It was one of the most lopsided victories in the history of modern warfare. In just 2 months, since the start of Operation Compass, O'Connor's Western Desert Force of around 36,000 men had advanced 500 miles, destroyed an Italian army of 10 divisions, and taken over 130,000 prisoners, 400 tanks, and 1,200 guns, at a cost to themselves of less than 2,000 casualties. The victory was total. The door to the rest of Libya was wide open. The last organized Italian forces in North Africa were gone. O'Connor saw the opportunity of a lifetime. His tired but triumphant forces could refit and then drive on, all the way to Tripoli. There was nothing to stop them. He believed he could knock Italy out of the African War for good. Right there, in February of 1941. He sent a signal back to headquarters, urging an immediate advance. And here is where the story turns. The great victory at Beda Fomm was so complete, so decisive, that it changed the entire war, but not in the way O'Connor hoped. From London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill saw the collapse of the Italians not as an opportunity to finish the job in Africa, but as a chance to open a new front. He was desperately worried about the German invasion of the Balkans. He wanted to send a British force to help Greece. And the only veteran troops available were the ones in North Africa. The order came down. The advance on Tripoli was cancelled. O'Connor's best units, the battle-hardened 6th Australian Division, the 7th Armored Division, were to be withdrawn immediately and prepared for shipment to Greece. Their place in the desert would be taken by green, inexperienced troops. The window of opportunity, the chance to seize Tripoli and end the campaign, slammed shut. Within weeks, on February 12th, 1941, a German general landed at Tripoli's airport to take command of the first German units arriving in Africa. His orders were simple: stabilize the front and support the Italians. He was an obscure panzer commander, little known outside of Germany. His name was Erwin Rommel. The trap was sprung. The road to Tripoli was open, and London slammed it shut.